Straight talk from Israel. You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio. You're listening to the Jay Shapiro Show.
Hello again, everybody. This is Jay Shapiro. Thanks for listening. My program today is divided into two distinct parts. The first part is essentially a reminiscence about the Yom Kippur days of the past. This year, our synagogue was closed and the congregation prayed in the street. It's easy to do in Israel because there is practically no traffic in Israel on this day of fasting. And this is even truer in Jerusalem, where the population, even those who are secular, do not disturb the sanctity of the day. We prayed in the streets in an arrangement where the worshipers were separated from each other by at least the distance specified by the Board of Health. And the services started early, and many of the standard songs and prayers were omitted so we would not be together for a length of time. And it was also a very hot day, so there was an additional reason to finish early. So Yom Kippur was different than any I had experienced in my lifetime, and it brought a lot of thoughts and memories to my mind that I took the liberty to share with the listeners. But the majority of the program is devoted to the fact that it was an anniversary. It was on September 28th, 2000, 20 years ago, after Israeli opposition leader Ariel Sharon, who was a right-wing former general detested by many Palestinians, had walked on Jerusalem's most hotly contested holy site, and protests broke out around the hilltop plateau in the old city. The compound is known to the Muslim as Haram al-Sharif, which means noble sanctuary, and the Jews call it the Temple Mount, and the whole problem quickly escalated. Of course, Israel blamed the Palestinian leader of that time, Yasser Arafat, who 2 months earlier at Camp David had failed to clinch a peace agreement with Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak. So it was an anniversary in a certain way, and I spent most of the time of the program talking about it because it's really important, and I want to keep it in the listeners' minds. Thanks again for listening. I will be back after the break.
The return of the Jewish people to the land of Israel was prophesied in the Bible thousands of years ago and is coming true today. Shalom. Join me, Josh Wander, on Israel Unplugged. Listen in as we delve into the spiritual and physical aspects of the Jewish return to Zion. We'll discuss the biblically mandated, historic, and of course practical understandings of this incredible transition from exile to redemption. That's Israel Unplugged, every Monday on IsraelNewsTalkRadio.com.
You're listening to the Jay Shapiro Show.
Hello again, this is Jay Shapiro. I want to start off the program with some thoughts and reminiscences without any notes on the table in front of me. I'm broadcasting this program on the 11th day of the Hebrew month of Tishrei. Tishrei is the first month in the Hebrew calendar, and the first 2 days of Tishrei are called Yom Rosh Hashanah, the beginning of the year, the head of the year. By the way, that term is not found in the Torah at all. It has other names. The 10th day of Tishrei, the first month of the year, is called Yom Kippur or Yom HaKippurim, and that is the Day of Atonement. Now, the major difference between the two is that the Rosh Hashanah opens up the 10 days of penitence, which is a period in which we're supposed to do soul searching, think about how we spent the last year and how we would like to improve ourselves, and to start off the new year, and take, I guess, what you would call New Year's resolutions to better our behavior. The 10th day of the month, Tishrei, is called Yom HaKippur or Yom HaKippurim, or the Day of Atonement, and it is a day when we ask God for forgiveness for the way we behave. But asking God for forgiveness, according to Jewish law, is dependent upon clearing your own record with your fellow man. You can't ask God for forgiveness for the sins that you have committed against Jewish law pertaining to the religious factor, ceremony, and keeping kosher, etc. But you can only ask God for forgiveness if you ask your fellow man for forgiveness for the things you've done against him. You've insulted him, perhaps you've cheated him, sometimes wittingly, sometimes unwittingly. At any rate, it's called from Rosh Hashanah to Yom Kippur. It's called the 10 Days of Penitence. And in Hebrew, it's called the Aseret Yemei Tshuva, which is exactly the translation, 10 Days of Penitence. And it's a time of essentially clearing the records for the year, looking into yourself and trying to improve yourself. Interestingly enough, when I was a kid, there were a lot of the 10 days of penitence is marked at the end of the Day of Atonement, which is the 10th day of the month. It's marked by the blowing of the ram's horn. The Day of Atonement starts at sundown on the 9th day of the month of Tishrei. It ends on sundown on the 10th month of the Day of Tishrei. And as I said, it's marked by the blowing of the ram's horn. And when I was a kid, as I started to say, there were a lot of people, and I'm talking a long time ago. I was a kid, it was more than 60 years ago. There were a lot of people who were no longer practicing the religion, but many of them were either European immigrants or children of European immigrants who still had a consciousness of the fact that there are 10 days of penitence. And even though they didn't keep the rules, and even though they didn't even attend services on the high holidays, they would come outside the synagogue on the night of the 10th, the end of the Day of Atonement, and they would stand there and wait for the sound of the shofar, the blowing of the ram's horn, which marked the end of the Day of Atonement. And many of these people, perhaps even most of these people, would fast. Even though they didn't keep any other rules, they knew they had to have fast on the Day of Atonement, and they would come outside the synagogue, even though they hadn't been there saying their prayers all day long. They knew that they had to wait for the sound of the ram's horn to know that the Day of Atonement had ended. And it was an absolutely fascinating to see. I did not appreciate it when I was a kid. I thought that's the standard thing. Today you don't see that anymore. This time around, it was a different high holidays than any that has been experienced in my lifetime. So I want to say a few words about it because it is so different, and I feel I must comment. What happened this year is that many synagogues were closed, and many of the synagogues that were open limited the number of people who could attend the services. One of the amusing things about this, by the way, is there is a custom for many years. I don't know what it was like in Europe. It was a custom in the United States and here in Israel that since there are generally a large number of people in a congregation, and there are a limited number of honors that can be given out, like being called up to the reading of the Torah. So the general custom was that you would bid for a chance to have one of the honors. It was more or less sold in an auction. There are many people who complained that that cheapens the services, and there were others who say no, it shows the importance and the value of the honors that you can get in the synagogue. And there were people who did it, and many of the honors were sold for lots of money. And I remember as a kid, one of the most enjoyable things was listen to the auctioning while people bid against each other in order to purchase an honor. And of course, as I said, there are those who say that bidding for an honor shows how valuable that honor is. So often it would happen that people who didn't attend synagogue all year round but had enough money would show up in the synagogue and purchase one of the honors. So what it essentially said to those who looked upon it positively was to say, even if you were not a regular attendee and you weren't religious at all, you knew how much the honor was worth. At any rate, what happened this year is the synagogue attendance was limited, and I myself got a number, and they didn't sell the honors this year. They gave them away because each congregation was very small, and there were enough honors to be given out to a small group. So I actually got several honors that in the past I was never able to purchase. So I suppose that's the positive side. The other thing is that many synagogues, like the one I attended, the services were held outside and people sat a respectful distance from each other. The synagogue I attended, everybody wore a mask. And the prayer was done in the street, and it was a very moving experience because it was so different. And the services, it was a very hot day here in Israel on Yom Kippur, so they began the services at 6 o'clock in the morning, and the services, which can take anywhere from 3 to 6 or even 7 hours, were limited from 6 in the morning to a little bit after 9 because it was too hot. And also, they didn't want people to be in the proximity of each other too long. So they eliminated many of the customary prayers that are added, many of which were written thousands of years ago and are sung to beautiful, beautiful tunes that we look forward to every year. So in that sense, it was a completely different high holiday season that I have known in my lifetime. And the last time there was a major plague, like where the coronavirus that we're having now is the Spanish flu, which took place about 100 years ago, around 1918, 1919. So, and in those days, of course, the people didn't travel much. Synagogues were more crowded, in particular in a place like the United States that was filled with immigrants, many of whom still carried their European habits with them. The synagogues were very crowded. I don't know how they handled the virus back then, but this time around it was altogether new experience, one which I hope will be once in a lifetime and won't happen again. Hopefully the coronavirus a solution will be found, a cure will be found before this time next year. It's been with us now since around February or March. So it's an altogether new experience for all of us, and the high holidays were different than any I have known in my lifetime. At the same time, it was very moving because the fact that the services were shorter meant you could concentrate even that much more on the words that you were saying. I'll come back to this subject after the break. I want to talk a little bit about the statistics. Jay Shapiro Show. I'll be right back.
Hi everyone, this is Andrea Simento from Jerusalem, inviting you to drop everything and join me on my show, Pull Up a Chair. We'll visit this week's quirky stories, meet fabulous guests, and discover my Israel. Together we'll laugh, shout, and explain the topics that make us say, hey, we've got to talk about that. So get comfortable and pull up a chair with me, Andrea Simento, every Thursday on Israel News Talk Radio.
Psalm 23, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. Did you know this psalm and many others were composed by a Jewish shepherd and musician who later became a king? Would you like to know some of the inner meanings of psalms to help you connect with God and strengthen your soul? An exciting and easy-to-read book is now available which will help you do just that. Software for the Soul, Psalms for Everyone, available on Kindle, Audible, and Amazon.com. Software for the Soul.
Modesty at the beach? It isn't just about body image. It's about feeling good. Modest swimsuits, so we don't get burned by the sun.
So we won't get ogled by strangers.
So we'll feel free to express ourselves without the need to expose ourselves.
Let Marcy Modest help you to cover up what you want, how you want.
Made in Israel.
Visit marcymodest.com. That's MARSEA modest.com.
And get a 10% discount on your first purchase.
You're listening to The Jay Shapiro Show.
You're back with Jay Shapiro. Now that Israel has essentially made peace with two Arab Muslim countries, I want to say a few words about our relationship with the Palestinians and the relationship of the Palestinians with the rest of the Arab world. A friend of our family is a fellow named Mordechai Kedar. He was in the Israeli army for many years in the area dealing with information and things of that nature. And he's now professor at the Begin Sadat Center for Perspectives. And he wrote a paper just recently in September, the end of September. And I want to share some of the things he said because I think it's enlightening. He writes that in Israel and much of the Western world, we tend to think the Arab world is unified in its support of the Palestinians, and that the Muslim world and the Arab world wants nothing more than to solve the Palestinian problem by giving the Palestinians a state, and that all the Arabs and the Muslims love the Palestinians and hate Israel. It turns out, according to Professor Kedar, that this is a simplistic and incomplete view. While it is true that many, even the majority of Arabs and Muslims may dislike Israel, there are many who dislike the Palestinians just as much. What is the basis of the hatred of Israel? The hatred of Israel stems from Israel's success as a minority in the Muslim world, and yet surviving wars and terror and boycotts and constant hatred. The hatred of Israel stems from the fact that a Jewish state exists, even though Judaism and the Muslim view was superseded by Islam, the true religion. This hatred is exacerbated by other stark disparities. For example, Israel is a democracy while many Arabs and Muslims live under dictatorship. Israel is prosperous while many Arabs are poor. Israel is a paradise compared to some Arab countries like Syria and Iraq and Libya and Yemen and Sudan, and the list goes on. In short, they despise Israel because it has succeeded in areas where they themselves have failed. Now, why should they dislike or even hate the Palestinian Arabs? After all, according to the Arab narrative, the Palestinian land was stolen by Israel and they were forced to become refugees. The answer to the question is complex, according to Dr. Kedar, but it is essentially a function of Middle Eastern culture that neither Israelis nor most Westerners fully understand or recognize. One of the worst things to experience in Arab eyes is to be cheated, fooled, or taken advantage of. When someone attempts to cheat an Arab, and even more so if someone succeeds in cheating an Arab, the Arab is overcome by furious anger. Even if the person who did the cheating was his own cousin, he will call on his brother to take revenge on that cousin in line with an old Arab adage, my brother and I against my cousin, my cousin and I against a stranger. Regarding the Palestinian Arabs, the first point to make is that many of them are not originally Palestinians at all. They are immigrants who came to the land of Israel from all over the Arab world during the British Mandate, which was from 1918 until 1948. And they came here in order to find employment in the cities and the farms that the Jews had built. So the other Arabs essentially asked, should they get preferential treatment as those who remained in their own original countries? Starting with the end of the 1948 Israeli War of Independence, the politics in the Arab world began to center on Israel and the Palestinian problem, the solution to which was to be achieved by eliminating Israel. In order to succeed in eliminating Israel, the Arab refugees were kept in camps with explicit instructions from the Arab League that they must be kept there and not absorbed into other Arab countries. In other cases of people being kicked out of the country, they were absorbed in other countries, like this happened in Eastern Europe at the end of the Second World War. What happened here is the Arabs, the Palestinian Arabs, were kept in camps, and the United Nations under UNRWA, UNRWA, ensured that they were provided with food and education and medical care without charge. In other words, other countries paid the bill, even as the Arab neighbors of these refugees had to work to provide food, education, and medical care for their own families by working. Refugees who were supplied with free foodstuffs and medicine and oil and everything else for the use of their families would often sell some of it to their non-refugee neighbors and make a tidy profit. And the other Arabs were aware of this. Residents in the refugee camps, for example, do not pay municipal taxes. This tax exemption has led a significant number of refugees to rent out their homes and collect sums in comparison with those renting apartments in nearby cities. In other words, the world subsidizes the refugees' taxes, and the refugees line their own pockets. Now, Lebanon, for example, several refugee camps were built near Beirut, but they were incorporated into the expanding city of Beirut, and they turned into high-class neighborhoods with high-rise apartment houses. Someone profited from this change, and it was not the man in the street. So the man in the street has every right to feel he's being cheated by the Arab refugees. Now, Also, what happened in Lebanon was that the camps were taken over by armed organizations like the PLO and others. They acted viciously toward the surrounding Lebanese, and in 1979 there was a civil war that lasted 14 long years of bloodshed. The war saw hundreds of thousands of Lebanese forced to leave their villages, only to enter in the lives of horrible suffering in tent camps all over Lebanon. In 1970, in Jordan, a Palestinian terrorist organization attempted to take over the country, to take over Jordan. They established all kinds of autonomous regimes of their own. They made a revolution against the king. King Hussein decided he had enough, and he'd show them who was boss. He declared war that cost thousands of lives on both sides. I recall I was living in Israel at the time in 1970 when Palestinians were swimming across the Jordan to get away from the army of King Jordan. Now, meanwhile, in Israel, 20% of the people living within the pre-1967 borders is made up of Palestinian Arabs. They did not fight and they do not rebel against the state, and they even have representatives in the Israeli parliament, the Knesset. In other words, the Palestinians living in pre-1967 Israel enjoy life in the only democracy in the Middle East, while the Arab countries sacrificed their soldiers to liberate the Palestinians. So every Arab knows the Palestinians have been selling land to Jews for at least a century, profiting immensely from these deals, and then complaining to their Arab brethren that there's a Zionist occupation. Over the years, the Palestinian Arabs were given billions of dollars and euros by the nations of the world, so that the yearly per capita income in the Palestinian Authority is actually several times greater than that of Egypt, Sudan, or Algeria. Their lives are many times better than the Arabs living in Syria, Iraq, Libya, and Yemen. On a political level, the Palestinians have managed to arouse the hatred of many of their Arab brethren. For example, in 1990, Arafat supported Saddam Hussein's invasion of Iraq. In revenge, in Kuwait, once they kicked out the Iraqis with the help of the Americans, they expelled some 400,000 Palestinians, most of whom have been living there for decades. As a matter of fact, I knew several Arabs working in a gas station across the street from Carnation, where I live, who had been kicked out of Kuwait by their Arab brethren. So this is a subject that's really important. I want to say a few more words about it in the next segment of the program. I'll be back because I think it's very important that the listeners understand the way the Arabs themselves feel about the Palestinians and their struggle, not only against Israel, but the way they have harmed other Arab countries. And now that Israel has made a peace with two Arab countries, this has come to the forefront. I'll be back after the break.
Are you interested in transforming your life, drawing closer to the Creator, and uncovering the deeper meanings and hidden treasures in the Hebrew Bible?
Then join me, Rav Yitzhak Michelson,
and me, William Hall,
on the Science of Kabbalah, where we are seeking to narrow the gap between what we understand of our physical and spiritual worlds. So make sure to tune in every Tuesday at 5 p.m. Israel time, 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, here on Israel News Talk Radio.
You're listening to The Jay Shapiro Show.
You're back with Jay Shapiro. I was mentioning before the break that Iraq invaded Kuwait about 20 years ago, and the Americans went and kicked the Iraqis out. But at that time, there were several 100,000 Palestinians working in Kuwait, and they supported Hussein. And therefore, as soon as the Hussein was kicked out and the Iraqis were kicked out, these Arabs, Palestinian Arabs, were kicked out of Kuwait and they came back to their villages. And as I started to say, I used to go every morning to a gas station right outside Karnei Shomron, the community in which I lived, and I had coffee with two Arabs. One of which had been living in Kuwait, was thrown out after the Iraqi invasion, and he spoke English quite well, and I used to bring him the Jerusalem Post newspaper for him to read. At any rate, the Palestinians were in bad shape because they weren't too well liked by the other Arab countries. Now we have a situation where the Hamas and the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, both terrorist organizations, a country, they are supported by Iran, a country that many of the Arabs don't like because they remember the airplane hijackings and the blackmail were invented by the Palestinian Arabs. It was they who hijacked an El Al plane to Algiers in 1968, 52 years ago, beginning a period of great difficulty endured by the entire traveling world. There was an agreement in 1989 that ended the civil war in Lebanon and was supposed to lead to the disarmament and dissolution of the Lebanese militias. But Syria allowed Hezbollah to keep its arms, develop its military power without restraint. The repeated excuse was that the weapons were meant to liberate Palestine and would not be aimed at the Lebanese, but turned out not to be true. It was clear that the Palestinian was a fig leaf covering the sad truth that the weapons were going to be aimed at the Hezbollah, Syrian, and Lebanese enemies. Palestine was simply an excuse for the Shiite takeover of Lebanon. Keep in mind that the Muslim world is divided into two kinds of believers, Shiites and Sunni. Most are Sunni, but the big Shiite country is Iran. And Iran, there's no love lost between Iran and the Sunni countries, and the Iranians are sponsoring uprisings and terror in the Sunni countries. Now, it's interesting that the Palestinians demand that the Arab states refrain from any relation with Israel until the Palestinian problem is solved to the satisfaction of the PLO and the other terrorist leaders. And by the way, this was the kind of reasoning that you heard from the previous American administration. Secretary of State Kerry was quoted, and I just saw that quote repeated a few days ago. He said, "You cannot solve any problem or resolve any problem between Israel and the Arab world until you first resolve the Israel-Palestinian problem." It turns out that was the thinking behind the American foreign policy in the Middle East up until Trump, because now it turns out that the other Arab countries don't really care about the Palestinians. They see them as a nuisance. What happens is they watch the various Palestinian groups, the PLO, the Hamas, and the Jihad, and all kind of other groups. They endlessly squabble with each other, and they ruin any chances, any kind of progress regarding Israel. And the Palestinian Authority has refused to sit down to negotiate with Israel for many years. So to sum up the situation, the Arab world, that particularly that part of the Arab world that sees Israel as a colleague and an ally, in dealing with Iran. And keep in mind, as I said a moment ago, we're talking about the Sunni Arab world, which does not care and does not like for the Shiite Arab world, which is represented by Iran. The other Sunni countries do not expect to mortgage their future on some kind of relationship between a Palestinian Authority and Israel, and particularly when a Palestinian Authority refuses even to negotiate with Israel. So, and you have to keep in mind that Egypt and Jordan have already signed peace agreements with Israel, and they moved outside the circle of war for the so-called liberation of Palestine, and they don't care about their Palestinian Arab brothers. They leave them to deal with the problem on their own. So the bottom line, according to research done by Professor Kadar of the Begin Sadiq Institute, an expert in the field, much of the Arab and the Muslim world is convinced that the Palestinians do not, in fact, want a state of their own. After all, if that state were established, the world would cease its steady donation of enormous sums to the Palestinians. And the Palestinian leadership, which is really take the money off the top and making itself rich with the money which is provided by other countries, including Europe, to help the Palestinians. So, again, there would be an end to the steady donations. There'd be no more refugees, and the Palestinian Arabs have to work just like everyone else. Now, what's happened is that the Palestinian Arabs have become addicted to handouts that come with no strings attached. So the Palestinian problem, the bottom line, the Palestinian problem that started in 1948 when the State of Israel came into being, the Palestinian problem will have no solution that will satisfy particularly the Palestinian leadership, because they've turned being a refugees into a profession, one that pays very well. This Palestinian problem has become an emotional and financial scam on the other Arab countries, and all it does is enrich the corrupt leaders in Ramallah and in Gaza. And Ramallah is the Palestinian Authority, and Gaza it's Hamas, because they kicked the Palestinian Authority out violently, and the leadership is skimming off the top. The overwhelming number of Palestinians are living in poverty, and when it comes to medical care, the Palestinians come into Israel in order to use the hospitals and the medical facilities. The Palestinian Authority is essentially running a scam. Essentially, you can say the Arab world is not at all interested in giving the Palestinian Arabs a state. They really are not interested. The Palestinian Arabs also don't want one. And when I say the Palestinian Arabs, I mean the leadership. The average Arab in the street, I truly believe, simply wants to make a living. And many of them are doing so by coming into Israel every day to work. I myself, living in Jerusalem, see all kinds of Arabs working in all the stores here. You go into a coffee shop for a cup of coffee and a piece of cake, the chances are you will be served by a Palestinian, by an Arab, who relies on Israel to make a living. So, to the Palestinian Arab leadership, the refugee status is the goose that lays the golden egg, and they don't want to see that come to an end. They're busy building huge homes for themselves and not caring about the average Arab in the street who has to come to Israel to make a living, except for those Arabs, by the way, who are working in Jewish communities in Judea and Samaria, and which they're making a decent livelihood provided by Jews. So the Arab countries apparently have given up on the Palestinian problem, and they're ready to let the Palestinian Arabs shift for themselves. And that, I believe, according to the experts, is the real situation. I wanted the listeners to be aware of it, because regardless of what you read in the papers and the headlines, these are the facts on the ground. And the chances of a Palestinian state coming into being and making a deal with the present Israeli leadership is simply something that is way, way out of even thinking about. These are the facts on the ground, and I think it's important that everybody be aware of it. I wanted to share these thoughts with the listeners. Until next time, take care of yourself.
If you love Israel News Talk Radio, then you'll love our Facebook page. We keep you up to date on what's happening in Israel, plus little surprise treasures that we don't share on the radio. Go now to follow us on Facebook. Just look for the Israel News Talk Radio Facebook page, and don't forget to subscribe and follow us by clicking on the like button. We post great stuff there that you'll want to share. Israel News Talk Radio on Facebook and Israel News Radio on Twitter.
If you're hearing this message, everyone else can too. Advertise with Israel News Talk Radio and get your message out to people. We'll build a personalized package for you. Contact advertising at israelnewstalkradio.com.
Straight talk from Israel. You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.
Hey, this is Jake in Anchorage, Alaska, and I love listening to all the super interesting interviews and up-to-date information on what's happening in Israel.
Hello, this is Anna King, originally from London, now living in Israel. And what can I say? Israel News Talk Radio is my cup of tea.
My name is Bhaskar. I'm from India, and I love listening because you get to know the truth and wonderful voices from this lovely country.
Mom! Okay, wait a minute. Hi, this is Chava Dax, and I'm calling from the rolling hills of Ma'ale Adumim, just north of Jerusalem. I always listen to Israel News Talk Radio to get all the latest news and commentary and to keep me up to date every day.
This is Sarah Dax from Ma'ale Adumim, and I'm 12. I wish Israel News Talk Radio was boring so my mom wouldn't listen to it all the time. Mom!
You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.
News, opinion, and more. You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.